If you keep giving everything in love and still end up feeling empty, it's not because you loved the wrong man, it's because you forgot yourself in the process. One of the biggest emotional traps women fall into in relationships is confusing effort with value. Many women believe that the more they give, the more they will be loved. They pour every ounce of their energy into the relationship, texting first, initiating conversations, checking in constantly, adjusting their schedule, showing up every time he needs something, and doing everything possible to keep the connection alive. Deep down, it comes from a genuine place of love and care. You want to make things work. You want to be supportive. You want to be the woman who stands by her man through everything. But what you often don't realize is that when effort becomes one-sided, it stops being a reflection of love and starts becoming a reflection of fear. Fear of losing him, fear of not being enough, fear that if you stop trying, everything will fall apart. When you start associating your worth with how much you give, you unconsciously begin to teach others that they can take without giving back. You start normalizing imbalance. And slowly, you find yourself in a place where your effort is no longer appreciated. It's expected. You stop receiving gratitude because your constant giving has become the baseline. What was once a generous act now feels like an obligation, and instead of being valued for who you are, you're tolerated for what you provide. That's when resentment begins to grow, not only toward your partner, but also within yourself. You start wondering why your love isn't enough, why the more you give, the more distant he seems to become. The painful truth is that overgiving doesn't make someone love you more. It only makes them comfortable doing less. Many women confuse emotional labor with emotional intimacy. They think if they can make him feel better, fix his problems, heal his wounds, or show him unconditional support, he'll see their worth and never let them go. But relationships don't work that way. You cannot earn someone's love by overextending yourself. You can't convince someone to value you by proving your loyalty again and again. True value in a relationship doesn't come from what you do for someone. It comes from who you are when you stand in your authenticity, your peace, and your boundaries. A woman's worth is not measured by her effort. It's measured by her sense of self, her emotional awareness, and her ability to walk away from what doesn't reciprocate her energy. When you find yourself doing all the emotional heavy lifting, you need to pause and ask, am I giving because I want to or because I'm afraid to lose this person? That simple question will reveal your truth. Effort should be mutual, not manipulative. Love should flow naturally, not be forced through constant proving. The problem is, when you overinvest emotionally, you often create a dynamic where the other person doesn't have to show up. You do it all. You care, you plan, you fix, you chase. And in doing so, you rob them of the opportunity to contribute equally. You end up in a relationship that feels more like a project than a partnership, where you are the giver, the healer, the caretaker, and he becomes the receiver of all your emotional labor. The heartbreaking part is that most women don't even realize they're doing it out of insecurity disguised as love. Society often praises women for their nurturing nature, for being selfless, patient, and forgiving, but no one teaches women how to balance giving with self-respect. You start believing that love means sacrifice, that to be a good woman, you have to be endlessly accommodating. But the reality is, the more you chase love through effort, the more disconnected you become from your own worth. You begin to associate love with exhaustion, as if the struggle is proof of its depth. You start equating your presence with performance, thinking that if you stop trying so hard, you'll lose everything. But love that demands constant effort from only one side isn't love. It's emotional imbalance masked as devotion. The hardest realization is understanding that being available for everything doesn't make you indispensable. It makes you replaceable because your energy becomes predictable. People start assuming you'll always be there, no matter how they treat you. And that's where the emotional shift must begin, when you recognize that you don't need to overdo to be enough, that your silence, your distance, your no carries more power than your constant yes. The moment you stop trying to earn your value through effort, you begin to attract relationships that value your energy without you having to prove it every single time. One of the most common yet painful mistakes women make in relationships is ignoring red flags because they fall in love with potential. Not the person standing in front of them, but the version they believe he could become. It usually starts with good intentions. You see glimpses of something deeper in him, his charm, his ambition, his dreams, or that rare vulnerability he shows in fleeting moments. And you hold on to those fragments like proof that he's capable of being everything you want. You tell yourself that with time, patience, and love, he'll grow into the man you see in your mind. You believe that your loyalty can inspire him to change, that your understanding can heal his wounds, that your consistency can turn his chaos into commitment. What begins as hope slowly turns into denial. You start minimizing behaviors that disturb your peace. You rationalize the distance, the excuses, the inconsistency. You start saying things like, he's just going through a tough phase, or he's not like this deep down. But deep down, you already know that what you're seeing is exactly who he is right now. When you ignore red flags, you're not being compassionate, you're being afraid. Afraid that if you confront the truth, you'll lose the relationship you've built in your imagination. The red flags are never hidden. They're usually right there in the beginning. The lack of emotional availability, the mixed signals, the broken promises, the dismissive tone, the way he avoids accountability when he hurts you. But instead of facing them, you cling to the good moments, the chemistry, and the potential of what this could be if only he changed. You begin to confuse attachment for connection and potential for progress. You find yourself waiting for emotional crumbs because you believe the feast is coming someday, but it never does. You end up loving a version of him that doesn't exist, investing years trying to build a relationship on imagination rather than reality. Many women make the mistake of thinking love is enough to fix broken patterns, but love cannot replace willingness. You cannot help someone who refuses to help themselves. You cannot grow with someone who has no desire to evolve. Yet when you're emotionally attached, your empathy becomes your weakness. You start overcompensating, making excuses for his behavior, or even blaming yourself for his emotional shortcomings. You tell yourself, maybe if I communicate better, he'll open up. Or if I'm more patient, he'll stop being distant. You make adjustments he never asked for, sacrifices he never reciprocated, and compromises that slowly erase your boundaries. The irony is that the more you tolerate the red flags, the dimmer your self-worth becomes. You lose sight of what healthy love looks like because you're too busy convincing yourself that this dysfunction is temporary, that this is just a phase. But what you don't realize is that potential is not a promise. A person's potential means nothing if they have no accountability, no effort, and no emotional maturity to fulfill it. You can't build a future with someone who's comfortable living in the same patterns that hurt you. You can't keep waiting for growth that never comes. The truth is, when you choose to see potential instead of reality, you end up emotionally investing in fantasy. You get addicted to the idea of what could be while neglecting the truth of what is. You start loving the man in your head more than the man in your life. You start holding on, not because you're happy, but because you're hoping. This is why so many women stay in emotionally unfulfilling relationships for far too long. They believe in his potential more than they trust their own intuition. They see flashes of good behavior and take it as evidence that change is possible, forgetting that consistency is the real measure of love. Potential is effortless. It costs nothing. But effort, growth, and accountability require maturity. And if you keep focusing on what he could become, you'll keep excusing who he is. Eventually, the relationship becomes a cycle of waiting, hoping, and forgiving, a cycle that leaves you emotionally drained, disconnected from your intuition, and resentful toward yourself for staying in a place where love feels more like a test than a blessing. One of the most heartbreaking mistakes women make in relationships is losing their identity slowly, quietly, without even realizing it's happening. It doesn't happen overnight. It starts in subtle ways, disguised as love, compromise, and care. You start adjusting little things at first, the way you dress, the way you spend your time, the people you hang out with. You stop doing the things you used to enjoy because they don't fit into the rhythm of your relationship anymore. You start checking your phone less when you're out with friends, canceling plans because he wants to see you, or silencing your voice when your opinions differ from his, just to keep the peace. At first, it feels harmless, even romantic, like you're simply blending your life with someone else's. But slowly, you begin to notice that you're not blending, you're disappearing. When you start making every decision around another person's emotions, preferences, and comfort, you lose touch with your own. You stop being the woman who had dreams, goals, and individuality before the relationship began. You begin to measure your worth through the lens of his approval. If he's happy, you're doing well. If he's distant, you feel like you're failing. Your emotional state becomes dependent on his moods, his validation, his affection. You stop listening to your inner voice because his voice becomes louder. And the scariest part is, most of the time, you don't even realize it's happening until you feel an emptiness you can't explain, a kind of loneliness that exists even when you're not alone. You start wondering why you no longer feel confident, why you don't recognize yourself anymore, why you feel disconnected from the woman you once were. It's because somewhere along the way, you traded authenticity for attachment. Many women confuse emotional closeness with emotional dependence. They believe that love means giving everything, all your time, energy, attention, and focus. But healthy love doesn't erase your individuality. It enhances it. The moment you start shaping yourself to fit someone else's expectations, you stop being your true self. You might start suppressing your opinions to avoid conflict, pretending to agree when you don't, or staying silent when you want to speak up. You start dressing the way he prefers, adopting his interests, and slowly letting go of your own. You may even start prioritizing his goals over yours, convincing yourself that we're a team. But in reality, it's become a one-sided partnership where you exist to support his growth while neglecting your own. The emotional cost of losing your identity is heavy. It creates a quiet resentment, not just toward your partner, but toward yourself. You begin to feel small in a relationship that was supposed to make you feel seen. You crave validation because you've forgotten how to validate yourself. You crave attention because you've stopped giving yourself any. You rely on his love to fill the void left by your own disconnection from yourself. And the more you try to hold the relationship together, the more distant you become from the woman who entered it, the confident, vibrant, self-aware version of you who once had her own world, her own rhythm, her own voice. This often happens because from a young age, women are taught to nurture, to accommodate, to adjust, to make relationships work at any cost. You are praised for being selfless, for putting others first, for being understanding, but no one tells you that there's a fine line between loving someone and losing yourself in the process. When you build your identity around another person, you set yourself up for emotional imbalance. You start believing that your value comes from being needed rather than being yourself. And when the relationship starts to shake, so does your entire sense of self, because your foundation was never built on who you are. It was built on who you thought you needed to be to keep someone's love. When you lose your identity in a relationship, everything becomes about maintenance, maintaining the connection, maintaining his interest, maintaining the image of us. You start walking on emotional eggshells, doing whatever it takes to avoid losing what you've already invested so much into. You might even stay in situations that make you unhappy because the thought of being without him feels like losing a part of yourself. But that's the illusion. The version of you that existed before the relationship hasn't disappeared. She's just been buried under layers of compromise, silence, and self-forgetting. And until you reconnect with that version of yourself, the one who existed before the we, you will always feel like something is missing, even when everything seems fine on the surface. One of the most overlooked mistakes women make in relationships is seeking validation instead of compatibility. It's easy to confuse the two because at first, validation feels intoxicating. The compliments, the attention, the good morning texts, the sense of being desired, all of it creates an emotional high that feels like connection. You start believing that his interest means alignment, that his affection means understanding, that his desire means depth. But validation is not the same as compatibility. Validation satisfies the ego, while compatibility fulfills the soul. The difference is subtle but significant. Validation is about being wanted. Compatibility is about being understood. When you seek validation, you crave reassurance that you are enough. When you seek compatibility, you look for someone who aligns with your values, your peace, and your growth. The problem is that most women mistake emotional excitement for emotional connection, and in that confusion, they end up settling for temporary approval instead of long-term alignment. From an early age, many women are conditioned to measure their worth through how others perceive them, through beauty, likability, and acceptance. This conditioning often bleeds into relationships where the focus shifts from, is he right for me, to, am I good enough for him? You start seeking his attention not because it nourishes you, but because it reassures you that you are worthy. You find yourself constantly analyzing his behavior, how often he calls, how quickly he replies, how affectionate he is, and your mood rises or falls based on those external cues. It becomes less about mutual connection and more about emotional survival. You begin to shape your behavior around what pleases him, laugh at jokes you don't find funny, hide opinions that might cause disagreement, and suppress your emotions when you fear they might push him away. Slowly, your authenticity fades, replaced by a version of you that's trying to be perfect enough to be chosen. Validation creates dependency. You start relying on his approval to feel secure in the relationship. When he compliments you, you feel confident. When he withdraws, you question your worth. It becomes a cycle of emotional highs and lows. One day you feel cherished, the next you feel invisible. This is the emotional trap of seeking validation. It ties your sense of value to someone else's behavior. It gives them power over your peace, Compatibility, on the other hand, is rooted in balance. It's about two individuals who share emotional maturity, respect, and alignment in values. But when you're validation driven, you overlook incompatibility because your focus isn't on whether he fits your life, it's on whether he accepts you. You start excusing emotional unavailability, dismissing lack of effort, or ignoring mismatched goals because the occasional affection or attention feels like proof that you're loved. When you chase validation, you often stay in relationships that don't fulfill you simply because leaving feels like rejection. The thought of losing his attention feels like losing a piece of yourself. That's why so many women settle for almost relationships. Those confusing, uncertain dynamics where the man gives just enough to keep you hoping, but never enough to give you peace. You tell yourself that if you just prove your loyalty, if you just love harder, he'll finally see your worth. But love built on validation is fragile. It keeps you anxious, always performing, always trying to be what the other person wants. Compatibility, however, allows you to breathe. It creates safety. It doesn't demand you to prove your value because it's rooted in mutual respect, not emotional performance. The difference between validation and compatibility is that validation needs constant effort to sustain. Compatibility sustains itself effortlessly. When you're compatible with someone, you don't have to chase reassurance. You feel seen without having to ask for it. Your peace is not dependent on how much attention you receive, but on the stability of the connection itself. But when you rely on validation, every moment of silence feels like rejection. Every disagreement feels like abandonment. You live on edge, always waiting for signs that you're still enough in their eyes. And when that validation is withdrawn, even temporarily, you start doubting your worth all over again. This emotional pattern becomes exhausting, leaving you constantly chasing love instead of experiencing it. Many women don't realize that the constant need for validation is a symptom of self-abandonment. When you're disconnected from your own sense of worth, you look for someone else to confirm it. But no amount of attention can fill the void that comes from not feeling aligned, understood, or emotionally safe. Validation might make you feel desired, but compatibility makes you feel at peace. When you choose validation over compatibility, you build relationships on unstable ground, on how loved you feel in the moment, rather than how well you truly fit together in the long run. One of the most deeply ingrained misconceptions women carry into relationships is the belief that sacrifice is proof of love, that the more you give up, the more loyal and worthy you become. From childhood, many women are taught to romanticize selflessness. You are told that good women endure, that they stay patient through pain, that love is about compromise even when it costs you your peace. You learn to measure love by how much you can tolerate, how much you can forgive, and how much you are willing to lose of yourself to keep someone else. This conditioning runs so deep that when a relationship demands your energy, time, and emotional stability, you don't see it as a red flag. You see it as commitment. You start believing that if you love hard enough, give more, and stay longer, your devotion will eventually be rewarded with appreciation and stability. But love that requires you to constantly sacrifice your happiness is not love. It's emotional depletion disguised as devotion. In many relationships, women fall into the role of the giver, the nurturer, the one who holds everything together. You sacrifice sleep, boundaries, friendships, and even your dreams to make sure your partner feels supported. You silence your needs because you don't want to be seen as demanding or ungrateful. You ignore your exhaustion because you've convinced yourself that love is supposed to hurt a little, that it's supposed to test your patience. And even when you start feeling drained, you tell yourself that this is what loyalty looks like, staying through every storm, forgiving every mistake, and never giving up, no matter how heavy it feels. But in reality, constant sacrifice doesn't create deeper love. It creates emotional imbalance. It teaches your partner that your limits don't exist, that your love comes without boundaries, that they can take without giving because you'll always stay. The most painful part of this dynamic is that it feels noble at first. You tell yourself that you're being understanding, compassionate, and strong. But over time, that strength begins to feel like suffocation. You start to notice that your sacrifices aren't being acknowledged. They're being expected. The more you give, the less you receive. The more you compromise, the more you lose touch with your needs. And the more you silence your pain, the louder your resentment grows. Love begins to feel like a job, something you have to maintain through effort, endurance, and emotional labor. You stop feeling appreciated and start feeling invisible. But because you've been taught that love is about giving, you continue anyway, hoping that one day your sacrifices will be noticed, that one day he'll see how much you've done and finally meet you halfway. This belief that sacrifice equals love also stems from fear. Fear of being alone, fear of being replaced, fear of being labeled as selfish. So instead of setting boundaries, you give in. Instead of expressing your needs, you suppress them. You begin to shrink yourself to make the relationship work. You say yes when you want to say no. You stay silent when you want to speak up. And you smile when your heart feels heavy. You convince yourself that love requires endurance, that the pain is temporary, that the emotional exhaustion is just a phase. But what's actually happening is that you're slowly disconnecting from yourself. You start losing the ability to distinguish between loving someone and betraying yourself for them. You begin to equate your ability to endure suffering with your capacity to love deeply. Sacrifice can exist in healthy love, but it must come from choice, not obligation. When it becomes your identity, when you constantly give more than you receive, it stops being love and becomes self-erasure. True love doesn't demand that you abandon your needs. It creates space for them. Yet so many women stay trapped in cycles of emotional giving because they fear that if they stop, they'll lose the relationship altogether. This mindset keeps you stuck in one-sided dynamics where love feels like work and peace feels like a luxury. You end up loving from a place of exhaustion rather than fulfillment, constantly pouring into someone who doesn't pour back. And even though your sacrifices come from love, they slowly become the very thing that empties you, leaving you feeling unappreciated, unseen, and emotionally disconnected from the person you once were before love became a test of how much you could endure. One of the most misunderstood aspects of modern relationships is the belief that setting boundaries will push men away. Many women grow up internalizing the idea that love means saying yes. Yes to emotional availability even when you're drained. Yes to forgiveness even when the same mistake is repeated. Yes to making space for someone even when they don't respect yours. You're taught that being easygoing, flexible, and endlessly understanding makes you more desirable, more lovable, more wife material. And so when the time comes to speak up for yourself, to say no, to disagree, to walk away from something that doesn't feel right, you hesitate. You fear that having standards will make you too difficult, too emotional, or too much. You worry that if you assert yourself, he'll lose interest or call you dramatic. But what you don't realize is that boundaries are not walls, they are filters. They don't keep love out. They keep self-respect in. When you believe that boundaries will scare men away, you end up overcompensating by being overly accommodating. You start saying yes to things you don't want to do, allowing behaviors that make you uncomfortable, and accepting half effort because you think it's better than being alone. You silence your feelings when something hurts you because you don't want to seem needy. You tolerate inconsistency because you're afraid that calling it out will drive him away. And every time you suppress your truth for the sake of keeping him, a part of you begins to disappear. You become more focused on not losing him than on not losing yourself. You start confusing emotional tolerance with emotional maturity, thinking that the ability to endure disrespect is a sign of strength. But in reality, it's not strength, it's self-abandonment. The truth is, boundaries don't push the right men away, they repel the wrong ones. A man who is emotionally mature, grounded, and ready for a healthy relationship will respect your boundaries because he has his own. He will see your self-respect as a reflection of your confidence, not your arrogance. But a man who benefits from your lack of boundaries will always make you feel guilty for having them. He'll call you controlling when you ask for consistency, distant when you protect your peace, and selfish when you put yourself first. The reason so many women struggle with setting boundaries is that they've been conditioned to equate love with acceptance, to believe that the more they can tolerate, the more they're proving their loyalty. But loyalty without boundaries leads to resentment. It teaches others that your comfort is negotiable, that your needs are optional, and that your silence can be bought with affection. Setting boundaries doesn't mean you're cold or detached. It means you're emotionally aware. It means you understand that love is not about merging into one identity, but about maintaining individuality within connection. Healthy relationships are built between two whole individuals who choose each other, not two people who lose themselves trying to keep the other happy. But when you fear setting boundaries, you often end up in one-sided dynamics where you're giving more than you're receiving, adjusting more than you should, and forgiving more than you can handle. You tell yourself that love requires patience, but what you're really practicing is avoidance, avoiding discomfort, avoiding rejection, avoiding the possibility that he might leave if you finally stand up for yourself. The irony is that the men who are pushed away by your boundaries are the ones who were never going to stay anyway. They were there for your compliance, not your character. They admired your giving nature as long as it benefited them, but withdrew the moment you asked for balance. Yet because you've been taught to associate love with approval, their withdrawal feels like failure, as if your boundaries caused the loss, when in reality, they simply revealed it. Every time you fear that setting a boundary will make you lose someone, you have to remember that losing someone who doesn't respect your limits is not a loss. It's protection. But when you don't know your boundaries, you become easy to manipulate. You start accepting apologies instead of change, promises instead of consistency, and potential instead of effort. You live in a cycle of emotional compromise where peace is always postponed for the sake of keeping the relationship intact. Boundaries are not barriers to love. They are the blueprint for it. They define how you want to be treated, how much you're willing to give, and what you will no longer tolerate. When you remove them out of fear, you invite chaos disguised as connection. You start mistaking emotional intensity for intimacy, drama for depth, and control for care. And before you know it, you're trapped in a dynamic where love feels conditional, where you can only be loved if you stay silent, agreeable, and endlessly forgiving. That's not love. That's compliance born out of fear. And the longer you suppress your boundaries, the more disconnected you become from your own truth, until love no longer feels like a choice, but a performance you have to maintain to keep someone from leaving.